Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Friday, it's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
David French, welcome back.
Well, thanks so much for having me back.
I know it's an incredibly busy season. There are so many things we could spend our time talking about today. It is Supreme Court decision season. You guys have been covering all kinds of fascinating cases on advisory opinions. And I think this week we have probably the two biggest decisions coming, which is 303 Creative and the affirmative action in college admissions case, which are going to be massive.
Huge.
So
also student loans and
right.
And maybe Moore v. Harper, which is the case about the independent state legislature theory, which is hugely important for our democracy, but might not be decided on the merits. So yeah, this is quite a time of the year.
So we're not going to cover any of that today, but I want to recommend anybody who's interested in that stuff to stay abreast of what you're recording with Sarah Isger on Advisory Opinions, because you guys have the best takes on all this stuff. I've learned a ton. So since we were together last month, former president of the United States has been indicted on 37 counts under the Espionage Act. That's not news. That's not something we should spend our time on. There was an attempted coup in Russia this past week, which has massive implications for the world, depending on how all this unfolds. We're not going to talk about that either. I want to talk about UFOs, David.
I'm here for it.
Okay, so every once in a while, you and I get to do a geek episode. We talked about Marvel movies one time for an entire episode. The UFO thing isn't just geek talk, though. It actually has significant cultural, philosophical, even national defense implications, and it's making the headlines a lot. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this. So what I want to begin with is just your take on some of the recent news items that have come out. The biggest one was a few weeks ago, a 36-year-old U.S. Air Force veteran named David Grush came forward with a whistleblower case that has gone through the Pentagon and now it's in the public, where he is claiming that he has knowledge that the U.S. government for decades has had a program that has recovered UFOs, essentially, vehicles or parts of vehicles that have non-human origins. He describes it as a worldwide effort going back to the 1930s. Some of these alien spacecraft, he says, are as large as football fields, and that both the military and military contractors have been trying to reverse engineer this technology. And he says we may even have the debris of these things along with alien bodies from them, which sounds very much like Roswell conspiracy theory stuff going back to the 1940s. And yeah, some of this stuff gets more and more sensational. So just to start with, what was your take on that story, and what did you find intriguing, troubling?
Yeah.
Totally non-credible. As a former military guy yourself, though not military intelligence as far as I know, what do you make of this guy?
So let me give you some defaults of where I come from. I'm extremely skeptical of multi-decade conspiracy theories that require many people within the government to perfectly coordinate total silence for years upon years upon years while sitting upon some of the biggest stories in human history, or if arguably the biggest story in human history. So
Ezra Klein, your colleague at New York Times, did a podcast about this, and he said the exact same thing. Like, that's the part that's not credible, is how do you keep... He doesn't think the government is that proficient at most things, but to keep this kind of secret for this long would be unprecedented.
Yeah. So all of the stuff that is said, the government has things, tangible objects, or... And I was about to say human remains, alien remains.
Right.
Those really ping all my skepticism meters, which is not to say that it's impossible, but we're close to impossible in that just what we know about human beings, what we know about human nature. I mean, heck, something as simple as if Trump knew that there were alien spacecraft remains, he might have taken part of them to Mar-a-Lago. I mean,
They would have been in his boxes.
They'd have been in his boxes. It's just really hard to conceive of that level of proficiency. At the same time, I'm not going to say totally impossible. But what I'm much more intrigued by, Skye, are the various kinds of sightings by Navy pilots in particular. Right. I have spoken to folks in the Pentagon who have told me really interesting things about this UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon, kind of aspect of the investigation. And there was a summary that was released back in 2021, and let me just read to you one paragraph. I'm going to try to highlight the key words that I found most intriguing. So here's how what the report said. Although most of the UAP, that's the unidentified aerial phenomena, described in our data set probably remain unidentified due to limited data or challenges to collection, processing, or analysis, we may require additional scientific knowledge to successfully collect on, analyze, and characterize some of them. We would group such objects in this category of pending scientific advances that allowed us to better understand them. The UAPTF intends to focus additional analysis on the small number of cases where a UAP appeared to display unusual flight characteristics or signature management. Okay, what does that mean in plain English? It basically means that we didn't possess the technology sufficient to evaluate what we were seeing. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that what we were seeing was beyond our technology. What it means is that our technology wasn't sufficient to analyze the data we were receiving. That's interesting. That's very interesting. And we have seen multiple people, non-crank pilots, who've come forward to say, and we've seen gun camera footage. It's been in the New York Times, for crying out loud, Skye, of objects displaying extraordinary flight characteristics. Now,
and in some cases, they have been caught by multiple sensors, not just radar, not just infrared cameras, not just eyewitness pilots, multiple, which gives it that much more credibility that there's something here we don't know what it is or can't explain.
Exactly. And again, that doesn't mean that you have proof that this is alien origin. You could have military experiments from a foreign power. You could have something much more mundane. It's really interesting. There was some discussion remember the wave of Chinese balloons or alleged Chinese balloons? There was some discussion that, some of this stuff was traced back to China, and some of it, where'd it come from? But it was definitely not alien. We're talking about balloons that were of human origin, of course, but transitory or passing sorts of or partial sensor looks can give off, unique or unusual sort of readings. But I'm with you, Skye. The part that I found most interesting was you can sort of explain away a radar anomaly, but what if it's picked up also on infrared? What if it's picked up by the F-14 next to you? When you start to have all of these different aspects, then it starts to seem like there's something there that's real, but again, it's all unidentified.
Yeah, to give some updated data, you've cited the report from 2021. There was a more recent report in January of this year that was given by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence that said in 2022 they had 510 UAP sightings, the vast majority of which have been explained. Many were balloon-like entities, they said, or plastic bags or drones or something like that. But there's 171 of these sightings that they say, quote, appear to have demonstrated unusual flight characteristics or performance capabilities and require further analysis. Again, they're not saying these are extraterrestrial, but they're yet to be explained. So this isn't going away. Now, here's the other thing that I think is different from when we were younger and these stories would pop up once in a while in kind of weird places, is you have very credible people talking about this. Former President Obama has been asked about it, and he said, yeah, I was briefed on this stuff when I was president, and we don't know what it is. John Brennan, head of the CIA during Obama's administration, said some of the phenomenon we're going to be seeing continues to be unexplained and might, in fact, something that we don't yet understand and could involve some type of activity that some might say constitutes a different form of life. It's a former director of the CIA.
Right.
John Ratcliffe, who was the director of national intelligence for Donald Trump, said this: there are a lot more sightings than have been made public. Some of those have been declassified. And when we talk about sightings, we're talking about objects that have been seen by Navy or Air Force pilots or have been picked up by satellite imagery that frankly engage in actions that are difficult to explain, movements that are hard to replicate that we don't have the technology for, or traveling at speeds that exceed the sound barrier without a sonic boom. Again, a CIA director or a national intelligence director.
Yeah.
James Woosley, CIA director, said this: people have reported various curious behavior of aircraft, and it may be something real that is an extraordinary change for some unheralded reason, or it may be a complex set of what is going on in the world of cyber and so forth. So he has an interesting take on it, that maybe this is all just manipulated data. But then you get Senator Mark Rubio, he's on the Intelligence Committee, correct?
Yeah.
He said there's stuff flying around in our airspace and we don't know what it is, and it's not ours. So we should know who it is, especially if it's an adversary that's made up a technological leap. So he's coming at from a defense point of view. And then most recently, Senator Josh Hawley, who I don't take most of what he says that credibly, but he said the number of these is apparently huge. And that is something that the government has, and best I can say about, downplayed, if not kept from the public for a long, long time. I think he's using this to kind of throw shade on the Biden administration, which is his, thing right now. But the fact that senators and CIA directors and national intelligence directors are all talking about this means it's not just a kook fringe anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the key point here, Skye, because you're starting to see reports from people credible enough using, again, sensors. This is not somebody coming forward as a whistleblower, but sensor data. This is stuff that's being recorded electronically that's highly unusual, just highly unusual. And I was talking to somebody in the Pentagon. This was a couple of years ago when this initial report that I read from came out. And, they're talking about, well, what could it be? And one idea was, look, our sensors just give off more anomalies than we thought, is one thought. Another thought is, yeah, this is a human technology that's slightly more advanced than what we expect. Maybe Chinese technology, probably not Russian, as we've seen, given their performance, but maybe Chinese technology that's just a little bit above where we are and therefore is giving off strange characteristics. And then the other one is, and this was an interesting point, he said, least likely, let's just put the alien origin as the least likely, but let's suppose there is such a thing as alien origin. And they were positing that this was drones, brilliant drones, that the distances in the galaxy that are just so staggering that we just can't conceive of technology that would allow living beings with finite lifespans to make the journeys required to investigate other planets. And so it's so far outside. I mean, we're, warp speed, come on, it's so far outside of our understanding of technology that you could have actual living beings here, that what would be most likely if it was alien would be very, very, very intelligent, advanced AI, very, very intelligent, advanced AI drones, which I thought was absolutely fascinating and is kind of the way we're moving in our own use of technology.
Yeah, going back to this whistleblower, Air Force veteran David Grush, he speculated that if it's not extra-terrestrial, he said it could be interdimensional, that maybe there's a way of moving through time and space that our physics hasn't yet uncovered, because the distances are so great. The likelihood of it has to be, the drone explanation would solve that, or this interdimensional thing, which seems like even a step further in science fiction. I do want to go back to him, though, for a second, and some of the whistleblower stuff that he's saying. And I'd like to draw from some of your legal knowledge and experience from the military. Without getting into the credibility of his interview.
Right.
Are there any implications for someone like him if he's just making this up? Completely whole cloth. Why what are the risks he's taking as a former military guy going through the Pentagon saying, he said he's getting threats, which is why he's gone for this whistleblower protection.
Yeah.
Why would he conceivably go through the process he went through? And should we take that as, he's been checked and there's some credibility here, or is it irrelevant to the way we evaluate his claims?
I don't think it's irrelevant, but it's certainly nowhere close to dispositive.
Sure.
So I think that what's different about some of these whistleblower claims compared to others is that the people check out. In other words, like their background checks out, right? And so some of the other quote unquote whistleblowers, when you kind of scratch the surface, things got shady really fast. And there are a lot of potential financial incentives in being a quote unquote whistleblower and all of this. So people could write off a crank or, somebody who is over time kind of transparently a con artist. So I think what makes people sit up and take notice of this latest round a bit more than the others is, I can't really categorize that person in this place, at least not yet, right? This is all kind of early in this unfolding story. So it's caused a lot of people to kind of sit up and take notice. And my colleague Ross, if I remember correctly, he wrote a newsletter kind of exploring this. And so, yeah, I do think that you've had a bit more credibility here. And it's coming on the back of, it's coming after a lot of these reports where no one is saying some of these Navy pilots, for example, are cranks because their testimony is backed up by data. But as far as what are the consequences, I mean, if he's telling the truth, when you are actually blowing the whistle on actually currently highly classified information that you've had access to and you are tasked with safeguarding, there's legal ramifications for that. But the interesting thing would be, wouldn't that be an interesting sort of confirmation of his claims if he's suddenly arrested for sharing classified information? But as a general rule, if you come into possession of information sort of on your own, then, or you are making stuff up. If you're just making stuff up, you can make stuff up. It's, the lies are illegal, lawfully illegal. And I mean lawfully illegal, I mean constitutionally illegal, only in some kind of limited circumstances. So, there's no real legal ramification other than if you con people out of money out of sort of telling fictional stories in public.
So I forget the name of it. There's an office at the Pentagon that service members have to clear information through. Let's say they're going to write a memoir or a book, or they're going to give an interview. There's an office at the Pentagon that clears you and the information you're going to share because they don't want secrets going out. They don't want information that would compromise the military or its activities to go out. So he went through that process. And some people have speculated, well, of course the Pentagon said he could share all this because it's complete nonsense and there's no credibility to it. So what do they care? Whereas if there was credibility to this, there's no way he would have been able to go public with it. But his argument is that this has been such a deeply shadow operation that even within the Pentagon, people don't know that this exists, that it's been this side project that's buried within, nesting dolls of programs that people aren't aware of it. Congress isn't aware of it. The president may not be aware of it, or even the Secretary of Defense. So it has all the markings of a conspiracy theory that you can't disprove. So what's the point? And it's all hearsay. He's not coming with actual documents or evidence or, here's a piece of spaceship material that no one can explain. But the fact that he went through the proper channels at the Pentagon, does that give him any credibility?
No.
Okay.
not to, because what the office is not fact checking you. Okay. What they're doing is they're trying to determine if you're disclosing classified information. In other words, if you're disclosing information that is and classified is even probably too narrow, information pertaining to the national defense. And so, one of the, as we know from the Trump indictment, you cannot remove information relating to the national defense from its place of custody to a place that's not where it's not supposed to be. So a lot of this is you're looking for classified information. Yeah, you're looking to see if somebody has information, is working from information they shouldn't have. So it's not a fact-checking process. And so at the same time, I like, and I was remembering, yeah, Ross did write something, and I just pulled it up, and it's interesting that one of his questions that he raises is, does the government want you to believe in UFOs?
Yeah.
Which is
this
kind
a
of
giant misinformation
which
strategy.
is an interesting, but which is again why this kind of thing, and some listeners might think, well, you're being ridiculous, but the more I hear this is about the most successful multi-decade concealment operation, the more skeptical I am. And so, again, I just keep defaulting back to the stuff that you're referring to in that long line of quotes, because that long line of quotes is all based on observations,
right,
as opposed to eyewitness testimony. Observations that include eyes and radar and infrared. So you add a new layer of confirmation to each one of these things, and they get just more and more credible, as opposed to one that's just eyes only, which is evidence, of course. Somebody can swear and attest to what they've seen, and that's perfectly functioning evidence in court. It's just less convincing than when that evidence is also confirmed by radar, also confirmed by other sensors.
So, going back to that, some of the more amazing stories that have come out from Navy pilots, for example, date back to 2004.
Right.
And that there was an initial report in the New York Times back in 2017 by Leslie Keene, who also broke the story about David Grush, the whistleblower we were just talking about. But the 2017 story had the testimony of these pilots, multiple Navy pilots, and what they saw. Again, nobody has questioned their testimony, partly because it was confirmed by some of the instrument and cameras that picked up what they saw. Why do you think it took so long for these stories to come out? And some of them are saying that this is not uncommon. Like, there's lots of Navy pilots that see stuff all the time. Why did it come out in 2017? Why is it trickling out in 21 and 23? Is there some national interest in getting this into the public hands? Why wasn't it kept secret?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, first, I think there's a really human answer as to why it didn't really come out, which is there's such natural skepticism of this in the broader public. Now, there might be sort of a interest from the standpoint of weird conspiracy theories are always interesting just because people kind of like to gawk and point at them. And let's suppose you're a super responsible F-18 pilot. I said F-14 earlier, but I think that F-14 was probably not the one encountering these if they were after 06. But
right,
F-18 pilot. So let's say you have an F-18 pilot and you are a super serious person. You are somebody who is skeptical of UFOs or would have thought it was absurd. You're somebody who values your public reputation. You're somebody who wants to be seen as sort of a pillar of the community, of somebody, a person that people can rely upon. What incentive is there for you to be running around, jumping up and down, waving your arms, going, I saw a UFO, I saw a UFO? And so there's a lot of incentive. The more serious you are, if you are sort of in this capacity of a pilot, and the more serious you are, there's almost more incentive not to say anything.
Yeah, but in the case of some of these stories, it was seen by multiple pilots.
Yeah.
In multiple aircraft. It was picked up by radar technicians on the ships and the aircraft carrier that launched these F-18s. So it wasn't like one pilot returns to the carrier and is like, yeah, I saw something weird, I'm not going to talk about it. And it was obviously reported to the Navy because they had the footage, they kept the files. That's what came out in 2017. So assuming that this has happened over the years or maybe even over the decades, and the Navy and the Air Force and others are sitting on this data, why hasn't it come out sooner? And why now?
It's a great question, but I can easily imagine why it doesn't. So you do not have in a typical aircraft carrier deployment a group of reporters that are on the carrier, right? Mm-hmm. So they're not sitting there sort of checking in with the pilots after every mission. Would you see anything strange? Then if you report it up the chain, well, again, it's not like reporters are just sort of hovering around Navy offices. This is not the way it works. And so then, yeah, it gets reported up the chain. And then the Navy often decides, what is it of all of the reports that we receive, do we issue press releases about? Do we actually talk about? And so I could totally see why no right-minded Navy public affairs officer would say, what, we saw a UFO over the, in the North Atlantic? Let's put out a press. And so it just percolates out there.
But there's a difference between issuing a press release and having a news conference about this stuff. There's a difference between that and the military, especially the leaders of the Pentagon, reporting to the appropriate committees in Congress about these activities and saying, hey, we are encountering some kind of objects in very sensitive areas over our carrier deployment groups out in the Pacific. We're seeing it over the Atlantic. We're seeing it over these various military establishments. We don't know what they are. We're reporting that to you in Congress because you give oversight to these things, and maybe they're requesting more money for research or budget or whatever. None of that happened because it didn't go to Congress. Nothing leaked out of Congress until very recently.
Yeah.
Which, in a weird way, makes me think, I'm not saying that this gives any specific credibility to David Grush and his cover-up idea that this has been a giant black ops thing since the 1930s, but this has been kept silent longer than I would have expected.
Yeah, I would agree with you, except that there at every stage there's sort of an escalating kind of cultural / credibility roadblock to saying something until you reach a critical mass. So who wants to be the Navy admiral, for example, to be the first one to say, hey, we're encountering these aerial objects that we can't really identify according to our current... It's that first... Who wants to be that first person to actually raise it to that level? Because the career and reputational risks are just giant. You could end yourself if you do that. And so I think of it as sort of like when something swirls around, if enough people have seen something, what ultimately tends to happen is if you're an enterprising reporter or if you're somebody who might be a whistleblower, you find out, oh, there's somebody else over here. And oh, I found somebody else over here. And then after a while, it starts to be strength in numbers of reports. And so that there's a critical mass when there's enough reporting, when there's enough data, when you can put it out there and you can say, look, here's the gun camera footage. And a reporter will also start to take you seriously. Because if you're wanting to preserve your reputation, one of the best ways to do it, not to be so biased in front of for my own employer, but it's going to be a lot better for you if your report comes out in the Times than it is in Breitbart.
Right.
And so, but then the Times is going to be looking at it with arms folded going, you're wanting us to write what kind of story? And so the level of evidence and sort of the level of the churn of the information, I think, has to reach a critical mass before the people have a lot to lose by reporting on it, feel comfortable enough to report on it. And that's why I've taken it so darn seriously, is so many people now who have so much to lose have now reported on it in highly credible ways. So that's why I take that much more seriously than even the whistleblowers. But I'm keeping one eye on them, Skye. I'm not dismissing them entirely, but I'm keeping one eye on them. But that's just not as credible to me as all of the other information.
Absolutely. And until we see more people come forward with similar claims or even some kind of hard evidence, skepticism is important. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as Carl Sagan said. This episode is being sponsored by AG1 by Athletic Greens. Some of you know that my dad is a doctor, and as I get older, he's always telling me to watch my weight and exercise regularly. But in the last few years, he's also been telling me to pay attention to my gut health. He's been persuaded by all the research saying that the biome of good bacteria that lives in our guts is critical to our long-term health. There's just one problem. I hate taking lots of pills and vitamins and supplements. And why do they always have to be so big? That's one of the reasons I was excited to try AG1 by Athletic Greens. AG1 is a foundational nutritional drink with 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food ingredients. I take it first thing in the morning before I've had my tea and before I jump into my morning routine of writing my daily devotional. And I'll be honest, it tasted way better than I expected. I've been doing it for a few weeks now, and I feel great knowing I'm supporting my health and not having to gag down a bunch of giant pills every morning. And that's why I've stuck with it, because AG1 is a super easy daily habit. So, if you're looking for a simpler and cost-effective supplement routine, check out AG1 by Athletic Greens. And right now, Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/holypost. That's athleticgreens.com/holypost. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit from all this reporting that's gone on over the last couple of years and some of the whistleblowers and the data, and let's talk about sort of the theological implications.
Fun.
This is where it gets fascinating for me, and we talked about it, I think, once or twice on the Holy Post, and Phil and Caitlin and others kind of roll their eyes at me like, oh, Skye, why do you care about this stuff? So I'm like, I need to get David here because I know you will entertain my conversation and engage me because you've written about this.
Yes.
You did a piece back in 21 called "When the Aliens Come, Will Their Arrival Destroy Our Faith?"
Yes.
Great
Notice
title.
I said when.
Right, when. You, ever the optimist. Subtitle, or will it teach us that creation is more magnificent than we imagined? So you kind of posit that let's just pretend we discover alien life, whether on this planet or somewhere out there in our explorations. You kind of argue both sides a little bit. You said on one side, the more naturalist point of view would say, see, it shows that life's not unusual in the universe. There's nothing special about Earth. There's nothing special about us humans. It's just the ordinary course of the universe that these intelligent beings will evolve and happen. The flip side would be, it's so unlikely that natural evolution alone would produce in multiple places intelligent life that it's actually more evidence for an intelligent creator. Right. So are we left with just whatever a priori views we carry are just going to be reinforced by whatever the discovery may be?
You know, Skye, that's a great way of framing it. And I kind of imagine that would be the case. And I quote a couple of different people because one of the really interesting questions is that was raised in a lot of the literature. And before I wrote this, I did a deep dive and found a surprising amount of literature out there sort of churning in the background of Christian commentary about exploring this very question of what if there were aliens, and with a particular attention to, does that mean that like Christ is Christ for the aliens? So in other words, if aliens come, do we need to start evangelizing them? Or is this evidence that maybe what happened, our faith in Christ and the resurrection is a part of God's particular relationship with humanity as opposed to all of creation? Or does it mean that, look, well, we had our mythology and they have their mythology. And so what I found interesting was there's actually a book called Alone in the Universe by David Wilkinson and the Royal Astronomical Society in England. And he looked at the case for aliens. This is older. He was very skeptical, but he found the implications of their existence exciting for Christians. And I loved this quote. I put it in my piece. While sharing much with other life forms, even perhaps intelligence and self-consciousness, human beings are embedded in the story of God's particular acts. This is not an appeal to human superiority. It is about an exceptional relationship, but not an exclusive relationship. Human beings can be special without denying God's love and concern for other intelligent beings, which I thought was a really, really interesting take. And then Piper's actually written about this. He argues that Romans 8 means that sin entered all of creation, all of it, all the galaxies, everything, through the fall of mankind and the redemption of all of creation comes through Christ. And again, this is Piper. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in pains of childbirth. And now, this is the Romans 8 passage, right? And he argues that means that this was all of creation. And others would say, that's more of a poetic formulation. So it's a really interesting kind of discussion.
Yeah, there's also, in the Piper quote and using Romans 8, and this applies throughout Scripture, when the Bible speaks of the earth or creation or cosmos, as the Greek would say, which we convert to cosmos or world or creation, you can argue that in those words have to be defined based on the knowledge of the author. So when Paul wrote Romans 8 and he speaks about all of creation groaning, well, what did Paul understand all of creation to be? He understood it to be the known earth at that time. He didn't even know there was a Western hemisphere. But,
right.
He knew the earth to be the earth. He had no way of knowing the magnitude and scale of the universe and the fact that there could be other worlds and planets. And
right.
So we need to interpret it with the author's original intent, which is just that world. But, okay, a couple things here. First of all, if we do find intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, I do think that would be a significant crisis for Christian theology, for some of the reasons you've already mentioned. Mm-hmm. Because part of the idea that all of creation fell when the man and woman rebelled against God comes from the idea that human beings are created in the image of God and have sort of a federal authority over the creation as God's representatives. So when they rebel against God, everything under their authority fell with them. But that assumes that we are the pinnacle of creation, that human beings are the image bearers of God alone, and therefore at the pinnacle of God's created order. If we find beings that are more intelligent or have powers beyond that of human capability, does it call into question that very calling of humanity to be God's representative, that special identity, as Wilkinson talks about? That'd be number one. But then flowing from that, the incarnation of Jesus as a human being to redeem all of creation was necessary because he had to be the second Adam. He had to then take on the identity of God's created image bearers. So all of that theology hinges on human beings being the pinnacle of God's self-image. So that would, I think, just send all of Christian theology into a tizzy if suddenly, we have other intelligent creatures on this planet. My dog picks up his own toys.
Right.
Steve is an intelligent creature.
Wait, pause. Seriously?
Yeah. I posted a video. My wife taught the dog. We basically sing the cleanup song like you do with the kids. Clean up.
Yeah.
And he will pick up all of his toys and put them in a basket.
Okay. I have 2 Labradoodles that need to come spend like 6 months at your house because they're just unending chaos.
Steve is an exceptionally intelligent animal, I think.
Okay.
Anyway, we have intelligent life. We go to SeaWorld, you can see the orcas if they're not murdering their trainers. And you can go to the zoos and see the apes and chimpanzees and other primates doing incredible things. We know there's intelligent life, but obviously nothing as intelligent as us. So It reinforces that Christian theology of us being the image bearers of God and the pinnacle of creation, and therefore the cause of its fall and the source of its redemption through the human God-man Jesus. All of that gets really challenged if there's creatures far more intelligent than us in the universe, right?
Oh, I think there's no doubt that it would trigger just an earthquake of a debate. Just an earthquake. Because one of the things that I have found is it's completely different to talk about something in theory than it is when actual reality smacks you in the face. That the emotion of a moment is so extremely dramatic that talking about things in the abstract is completely different than dealing with them in the concrete. So there's absolutely no question. It is not that you would immediately have all of sort of the more ecumenical parts of Christianity going, oh, okay, this is God's wondrous creation and just demonstrates his capacity for creation. And I can't wait to sort of dive into how God has worked in their story. And then the much more fundamentalist folks will say, well, now our collection is for the mission trip to the Klingons, right?
Right.
And which, who wants to volunteer for that duty? So I don't think it would fall like that. You would have just an enormous kind of earthquake occurring. People would be having their worldview shattered at the same time, quite frankly, Skye, that there'd be just an enormous wave of fear.
Sure.
Because the moment this became sort of a reality, you would know immediately that there are other intelligent life forms with a technological capacity that utterly dwarfs our own, and that we would face, at the flick of a wrist, colonization, extermination. I mean, you name it. And so the wave of fear is, again, something that we can't really comprehend. If this was all made manifest and plain, that there is, an alien presence. So I think it's, in some ways, we just can't know, but we do know enough to know it would be an absolute earthquake. And as I put in my piece, sometimes when we face unexpected developments, we can actually go back to the world of fiction to sort of help us think through. And, we've seen this in AI, right? Everyone's referring to Battlestar Galactica and Terminator and Skynet and all of. But there's seminal works of fiction in Christian literature about dealing with other worlds, and that's the C.S. Lewis space trilogy.
Mm-hmm.
And, Christians have read those books for generations and found them deeply encouraging as a matter of faith. And not because they believe there are aliens, but the way in which sort of Lewis reveals the nature of God and creation, and the way in which Lewis, they're just really encouraging books to read. I mean, Paralandria is one of my top 5 books in my whole life. And I could easily imagine, if we found evidence of intelligent life, that all of a sudden the C.S. Lewis space trilogy amongst Christians starts outselling everything. People think through the conception.
That brings up an interesting point that I wanted to ask you about. Like, I think if we suddenly found clear evidence of intelligent life out there in the universe, maybe it's a SETI signal that we decipher and realize, there's intelligent beings out there, or some probe we launched back in the Voyager or whatever in 1978, we get some signal back and we realize, okay, there's intelligent life out there. I think that'd be challenging for all the reasons you talked about, and great. I think there's something really different if we found out that there was alien visitation to Earth, and that had been going on for a long, long time. I think that is very different. And the added challenge I would bring beyond the ones we've already discussed is, I think it would call into deep question the authority of the Bible. And here's what I mean. I think a lot of us go to Scripture and we expect it to give us, if not a scientifically accurate, a theologically accurate depiction of the world we occupy. Meaning, it's a world that was created by an intelligent, loving, benevolent God. It's a world in which there are obviously the physical creatures upon the world, but there are spiritual beings as well that exist, God chief among them. It's a world that has a telos, a purpose that's going someplace. It's a world in which the events recorded in Scripture are accurate to history. Like, Jesus really lived. He really rose from the dead. Israel, King David, all these things really happened. Egypt, the Exodus, that kind of stuff. If we find out that there has been intelligent life here throughout all of human history from an extraterrestrial source that has been around, and the Bible was utterly silent about that and gives no even way of fitting that into the framework, I think that would utterly challenge everyone's credibility of Scripture. It's different than saying, well, the Bible doesn't say anything about dinosaurs, and when we found those bones, we didn't freak out. Well, yeah, obviously, because from what we can tell, there were no human beings alive at the same time as the dinosaurs. They didn't record that. We wouldn't expect that to be recorded in Scripture. But if there has been alien visitation of this earth for thousands of years, including throughout biblical history, and there's no indication of that as part of God's vision of the universe and that he revealed to us, that would be really troubling.
Oh, I think, again, earthquake understates the way it would shake. I mean, earthquake followed by tsunami, followed by earthquake. But there's a segment of our listeners whoever's left. I wonder what percentage is still with us, Scott.
There's 2 people left.
Let us know in the
people.
One of you is jumping up and down, going, "You haven't explored one other option here, which is that these are spiritual beings."
Yes, and that's come up on social media whenever these stories hit the internet. It's like, well, of course, this is demonic, or it's angelic, whatever.
Yeah. So there's the other option that we had not explored of all of these, is that exposure to tangible manifestations of the spiritual.
Which maybe gets back to David Grush's argument that these are interdimensional travelers of some kind. But again, like, why would they need metallic craft to travel in? That seems kind of...
And also, it would be really disappointing to me personally to learn that there's a multiverse, since I hate that aspect of superhero sort of mythology.
Totally agree with you.
Yeah, that would be profoundly disappointing.
Well, and to really nerd out here, David, there is a difference between a multiverse and multi-dimensional universe.
True.
I mean, the Christian worldview would say we live in a multi-dimensional universe in which there are dimensions present that we may not measure or experience. The multiverse, as developed both by fiction and by some theoretical physics, is to say there's an infinite number of universes that there may be replicas of us in those universes doing different things. And that's kind of where Marvel and these others are going wacky. I can't stand that either. But the idea of multi-dimensions, I find completely credible.
Yeah. Much more credible than multiverse. And I'm much more invested in there being no multiverse, because I find that tedious.
I do too.
But it's a huge earthquake. And I do, I as I wrote in my piece, I kind of prefer, just from a conceptual abstract standpoint, since we're all talking theoretical, I prefer the Wilkinson formulation. Human beings can be special without denying God's love and concern for other intelligent beings. That's the Wilkinson formulation, to the Piper formulation, which is, Jesus came here, he redeemed all of creation. In other words, it's sort of Jesus redeemed all of the universe through this particular planet, and everyone from any of these other civilizations, that Jesus would be their Lord as well. I don't know. I don't know. That strikes. I don't know. But there's one thing about there is one thing about Piper's statement that I thought was really powerful, and this was his ending, and I quote it in my piece: "God reigns, you're his child. What could be more secure?" And in an interesting way, I feel like there would be an almost, at the same time you would have a big earthquake, you would also have a huge impulse and longing to reach for God as a source of security. So sort of God, whereas the particulars of theology would be really, really shaken. Sort of the longing for God might be magnified in that circumstance. And so, it's just interesting to conceive of. And I do wonder, has there been some really good fiction from a Christian perspective, like working this, other than the Lewis trilogy, which is distinct, but it seems like there's some we're crying out for a good book on this guy.
Oh, I wouldn't object to that, as long as it is a good book and not some of the nonsense. Like we've talked on the show before about like the Frank Peretti novels about spiritual warfare, which I think were profoundly malformative for a lot of Christians, very negative. So I'd hate to see something like that happen with this topic, where it leads us in a bad direction theologically or culturally. But yeah, we need more thinking on this. So let's project ahead a little bit as you look at the pace at which information is coming out since 2017, especially, and just the transformation of this topic from the time we were young to today. I mean, who would have thought the New York Times would be talking about this, or presidents would be openly talking about it? Like, it's crazy. So do you have any thoughts on, in the next 10, 20 years, where you think this conversation's going?
Yes. And actually it links to AI. So I think that we're going to see an almost exponential rise in our ability to analyze and discern data over the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years.
Not just AI, but quantum computing is
quantum computing, AI. So I think it's really interesting, right as we're not even through with what you might call the information revolution. We're now on the front end of the AI revolution. And everyone who tells you, I know exactly how this is going to unfold, I think if they get it right, they're more lucky than good. We don't know exactly how this is going to unfold, but there are a few things we do know, and that is that fully developed AI is going to have a capacity to help us understand phenomenon, and sort of a capacity to be able to boost our level of knowledge and understanding, really in considerable and often maybe unforeseeable ways. And so I do think our capacity to understand and analyze data is only going to get more potent and get more potent quickly. And
so how does that relate then to UAPs, UFOs, whatever?
So I think to the extent that what we're dealing with are conventional or naturally occurring objects that we just only got a partial glimpse at, or our ability to analyze was inhibited, I think you'll clear up a lot of that confusion. So you'll be able to sort of sweep away the stuff that is the product of partial information that we just couldn't quite analyze well enough. Like a good example might be, the Titanic submersible, when there was the sound of the implosion that was heard almost immediately. And it's, as best I understand the state of the story, and this may evolve, that wasn't enough to be definitive right away, but it took sort of time and matching of records and all of this to sort of figure out that, that what we heard on that day was this implosion.
And then, of course, the rovers ultimately found the debris,
right,
which confirmed it. Right.
Right. And so I think you could have something where what you have are better ability to cross-reference data, understand data, and it could clear some of this stuff up. And then the stuff that isn't cleared up, you might be able to see it better. So you're going to get better visibility. This is the kind of composition of it. This is what it looks like up close. These are its flight characteristics. So you're just going to have a lot more information in 15 years that we're going to be better able to analyze. And we may reach a point where 10, 15 years from now, we say the best reasonable explanation for what we're seeing is a brilliant drone or something along those lines. But I don't know. I do think that we're going to have a lot better capacity to understand what we see in our lifetimes.
Well, we've already seen that happen. I mean, obviously I have no insights into the details of military technology, but I got to believe it's magnitudes better than it was in the 1970s or 80s. So
yeah,
the technology we have just in civilian life is magnitudes more brilliant than it was when I was a kid. So what the military has to even be better. And so my hunch is we haven't seen the best data that the military actually has on these UAPs, because it would disclose technology that the military doesn't want us to know it has. So maybe part of the reason these stories have come out when they've come out is because the data is so much better than it used to be. And you're right, 15, 20 years from now, it'll be that much even better. And we'll clear up any of the ambiguity that still exists. But it doesn't mean these questions are going to go away. So we need Christian theologians, philosophers, and military experts even thinking through what are the implications of all this. But
can I make a kind of a point about sort of thinking through these really unexpected things are really important for thinking through how we approach the world. So I have had a lot of discussion over the last few years, and Skye, you've been a part of it too, with sort of this fundamentalist versus evangelical divide. Mm-hmm. And there was this Rick Warren discussion of what's the difference between a conservative Baptist and a fundamentalist Baptist that lit the internet on fire on Russell Moore's podcast, where he said a conservative Baptist believes the Bible is inerrant. A fundamentalist Baptist believes their interpretation of the Bible is inerrant.
Right.
And so a lot of the argument has been, well, the people who are sort of more ecumenical, well, you're moral relativists. You don't have any fixed guy. You don't have the North Star, and we have the North Star. And my response to that is existential humility is not the same thing as moral relativism.
Yeah.
And I feel like when we're approaching the wonder of creation, we should approach it with a high degree of existential humility, but that is not the same thing as saying anything goes. A person with existential humility still endeavors to do their best to live according to what they discern, what they, in their best good faith effort, discern to be true and real and good and beautiful, but they have a background level of existential humility. And I'll tell you the thing that has really convinced me of that, just scripturally, almost more than anything else, was how when Jesus came, almost no person who were the key teachers of the law and the key interpreters of the prophecies recognized him. So everyone who had the most sort of existential certainty about what the Messiah was going to look like missed it completely. And who could see it? Who could see it? A lot of the people who had those open hearts.
Right.
And so that has always really sobered me, Skye, sort of this idea about, 2,000 years ago, the teachers of the law couldn't see Jesus when he was right in front of their face. But my goodness, I've interpreted these scriptures very precisely.
Yes.
And so that's always given me this giant pause that, I think that really what I need to be thinking about is the state of my heart versus that, I've figured out the scriptures. And let me tell you how specifically I figured out the scriptures.
Yeah. There's a talk I've given somewhat frequently since 2020, since the pandemic. Once things opened up a bit more and I was traveling and speaking again, there's a talk I've done based on John chapter 9 called How Certainty Makes Us Stupid.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what you're talking about. That's a story of Jesus healing a blind man. And it's one of my favorite chapters in the Gospels. And there's so much relevant to what we're seeing in the world today. And what we do when we encounter information that doesn't fit our preconceived ideas of certainty, and how we try to silence those sources of information, how we banish them, how we discredit them. It's the fake news argument. And in that story, all the religious leaders, because of their certainty, go to greater and greater sinful extremes to silence people, to shut down Jesus, to kick him out. And it's the man who has humility, who says repeatedly, I don't know. He's the one who ends up falling on his face before Jesus at the end of the chapter, worshiping him because of his willingness to admit he didn't have it all figured out.
Yeah.
And that certainty, while it's comforting because it makes us feel like I know how the world operates and I know what to expect and I don't have to be afraid, you're putting your faith in your interpretation rather than your faith in this God who is beyond our ability to fully comprehend.
Exactly. And that goes back to Job. In Job, he's getting all of this bad advice from the friends, and God kind of comes in and he doesn't say, here's why all the friends are wrong. He basically goes through this long exercise of I'm God and you're not God.
Exactly.
In which Job's response, I almost said Joe. Job's response is I'm putting my hand over my mouth.
Right.
In Skye, you and I both had very similar reaction to Shiny Happy People in the Gothard situation with this quest for certainty. I want to be sure how to raise my kids and everything's going to work out. I want to be sure how to have this marriage where everything's going to be great. And that quest for certainty leads us in really down some pretty dark paths. And so I feel like, we're going to be facing that same kind of conundrum when we are exploring aspects of the natural world that we still haven't even begun to understand.
Yeah, well, that's why I wanted to talk to you about this, because I know the posture with which you take most of these things, and whatever comes out in the future, it might be, as you put it, an earthquake, a tsunami on top of another earthquake, an earthquake sandwich, tsunami sandwich. It could be really, really unsettling, but to have it in an open hand, hold our theology in a somewhat open-handed posture to say, I haven't got this all figured out, and I need to be open to what the evidence actually reveals. Still be skeptical, right? Still demand really clear evidence of something that's an extraordinary claim, but not to be shaken by it. And that's what, when you have built your entire life around certainty, anything that challenges it is met with profound fear and seen as an immediate threat. And I don't think that's how we as Christians are called to carry ourselves, whether it's toward our neighbors, the future, or the possibility of extraterrestrial life.
Right. I mean, do you approach, sort of approaching the world and approaching the unknown with a sense of faith and hope and confidence versus apprehension at the thought that if things break one way or another way, then my worldview, the entirety of it, will be confronted with irreconcilable conflicts. And look, there's no way to approach the unknown free of fear. We're people, we're human beings. But I do, let me just put it this way. I am unreservedly, at least at the moment, excited to learn more about these UAPs. And my unreserved excitement might give way to something much more trepidatious if things are clarified in certain ways. But the question is, Skye, going back to Independence Day, the movie, do you remember?
I remember.
So if the giant disc comes down, are you on top of the tower waving your welcome sign, or do you have the gun and the dog and you're in the RV heading for the hills? Which direction are you heading?
I'm probably heading for the hills, honestly.
Just a big wait and see. Like, I'm not on top of that tower. There's no way.
No. Well, David, thank you for nerding out with me for another hour. I'm genuinely so grateful that we have someone like you writing in the places you are, who represents the faith in a thoughtful way and can engage this stuff with a sense of humor as well. And it's so refreshing. I appreciate you coming back to the Holy Post every month to do that.
Oh, I love it. I love our conversation, Skye.
And we are going to keep track of all the Supreme Court stuff coming out. This is going to be a great week. I know it's super busy for you. I'm going to be checking in daily to see what new podcasts you guys have put out through Advisory Opinions, because I can't wait to hear your analysis of this stuff. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, this week is like Christmas for me in some ways. I have, there are certain ways I want the cases to come out, but I also just love stepping back and sort of figuring out, this is where the law is going. This is where the court's thinking. That part of it is a lot of fun and interesting, even separate and apart from which side should win or should lose. Yeah,
I was just listening to recent episodes as some opinions have been coming forward, and you and Sarah will have months ago talked about what you predict some of the outcomes are going to be. And it's so fun hearing you going, oh, I'm not as sure as I used to be that I got that one right. Because as you see the opinions coming out, you can kind of check and go, oh, maybe that one's not going to come out the way I thought. And I know you guys have fun with it. Although there are, these are massive cases with real implications for our society and law and government. So they're big, but you guys make it really engaging. And I understand probably 75 to 80% of what you guys say, because I'm not an attorney, but it's been hugely educational for me. Anyone else who geeks out on that stuff and likes understanding law, you've got to listen to Advisory Opinions. It's so good. So anyway,
thanks, Scott.
David, thank you so much. French Friday is a production of Holy Post Media, featuring David French and me, Skye Jethani. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This show is made possible by Holy Post patrons. To find out how you can become a Holy Post patron and to find more common good Christian content, go to holypost.com.